He stood beneath the dull hospital canopy, rain sliding off the brim of his worn cap and tracing slow paths down his jacket. The morning light hadn't fully settled yet. Everything looked gray, as if the world itself held its breath. Inside, voices moved like distant echoes. Outside, he kept wiping his hands on his jeans, as though trying to clean off a day that had not even begun. A crumpled work glove hung from his pocket, soaked from the storm, the fingers bent in a kind of quiet exhaustion. He watched the automatic doors open and close, opening and closing, each sigh of machinery a reminder that somewhere in this building, a life was balancing on the edge. This is Stories That Heal the Heart, where we tell real-life style stories about injustice, quiet kindness, and the ways forgiveness changes the shape of a soul. Here, people who've been overlooked, rejected, or forgotten discover that even the smallest gesture can carry the weight of redemption. And sometimes, the one who's been hurt the most becomes the one who holds the power to save. If you've ever walked through a season where someone made you feel small, if you've ever carried more than your share of silence just to keep going, if you've ever wished someone would see your worth before it was too late, then this story is for you. Stay with me, because what happened inside that hospital corridor reshaped two lives that had been on opposite sides of the same wound. No one out there on that muddy construction site ever imagined the truth that would come to light, a truth about pride and labor and the cost of a man's dignity, a truth about a father who shouted orders and a worker who took them quietly because he had a little boy at home waiting for dinner to be on the table. A truth that had been buried under years of humiliation until the sound of screeching tires on wet asphalt turned their lives in a direction neither of them saw coming. Rain tapped the pavement in slow, uneven beats. A nurse hurried past holding a clipboard. A child's cry drifted from somewhere down the hallway, thin, trembling, scared. The worker lifted his eyes at the sound, noticing a little girl in a pink jacket clutching the sleeve of her mother, her face pressed against the fabric to hide the tears. Somewhere above them, a monitor beeped. Somewhere behind the closed doors, a man fought for breath. He took a step closer to the entrance, then paused. The sliding glass reflected his tired face back at him. The stubble he hadn't shaved, the bruise on his arm from a falling board the day before, the quiet resignation of someone who's learned to survive by lowering his voice. He looked down at the small plastic donation band still wrapped around his wrist from earlier that month, a reminder of something he had promised himself he would do again. The rain softened. The hallway lights flickered. His breath formed a small cloud before disappearing. This is the story of a man who had every reason to walk away, and the morning when he didn't. The story of a wound inflicted over years and the unexpected moment when compassion refused to die. The story of a girl's tears, a man's silent choice, and a life that hung by a thread only one person could hold. If stories like this remind you that goodness still exists in ordinary people, please like and subscribe, so these voices of hope can reach more hearts waiting quietly in the dark. He stepped forward at last, letting the doors slide open, the warm air brushing against his cold skin. Inside, a nurse lifted her eyes as he approached, as though she had been expecting someone, but not him. And as he crossed the threshold, he pressed his fingers against the fabric of his jacket, feeling something small and folded in the pocket, something he wasn't yet ready to look at. Tonight we remember that, even in silence, love still answers. He walked into the hospital corridor with the same posture he carried on the construction site. Shoulders slightly lowered, hands uncertain, as if apologizing for taking up space. The air smelled of disinfectant and wet jackets, and the overhead lights hummed softly. He paused near a row of plastic chairs, brushing the rain from his sleeves. The floor glistened with footprints from people who had rushed in minutes earlier, their panic leaving a trail the staff already moved to erase. To his right, a vending machine flickered with a stubborn light. To his left, through a half-open door, he saw a pair of boots abandoned near a stretcher. Nurses passed by with purposeful strides. A doctor murmured something into a phone, and somewhere farther down the hallway, past a curtain of sterile blue, a man fought to keep his heartbeat steady. He recognized the jacket first, the expensive dark wool, the polished buttons, the fabric untouched by labor or dust. Then he saw the man wearing it, or rather, the man lying beneath it on a gurney, pale and motionless. He didn't need anyone to tell him who it was. Years of shouted orders, slammed clipboards, and muttered insults had engraved the boss's face into his memory. Now that same face was drained of color, softened in a way he had never seen. Vulnerability had settled over it like a thin veil. A nurse closed the curtain around the bed, but not before he saw the boss's hands. Strong hands that had once pointed at him from across the site, hands that never trembled. Now they looked fragile, the knuckles slightly blue. He swallowed hard, looking away, unsure whether to stay or leave. The girl in the pink jacket from earlier stood a few feet away, her face buried against her mother's coat. Her small shoulders shook as she cried. When she finally turned, their eyes met for a moment. He recognized the fear in her gaze. The same fear any child feels when the world they depend on slips out of reach. She clutched a stuffed bear missing an ear, hugging it so tight her fingers had gone white. Her mother knelt beside her, whispering reassurances that carried more hope than certainty. He moved closer without thinking, drawn by something he could not name. Rainwater dripped from his hair onto the floor, forming small dark spots on the tiles. A nurse approached him, scanning the bracelet from his previous donation, her eyes widening when she read the information. "We might need your help," she said softly. "He's lost a lot of blood. We're testing everyone available, but the match we need is very specific." He nodded, his throat too tight for words. The nurse gestured for him to follow, leading him to a small waiting area near the lab. He sat down, resting his elbows on his knees, rubbing his palms together in slow circles. A faint buzz of fluorescent lights hovered in the air. The room felt colder here. He looked around the hospital and thought of the construction site. The contrast felt sharp. Steel beams and dust replaced by white walls and quiet steps. He remembered the way the boss had spoken to him just 2 days before. The sting of those words landing harder because he needed the paycheck. That morning, the boss had thrown a blueprint onto the ground and told him to pick it up like he was meant for the floor. He'd swallowed the humiliation like he always did, thinking of his son's backpack that needed replacing. The rent due, the groceries still missing. He leaned back and exhaled slowly. Years of quiet endurance filled the silence around him, settling beside the faint beeping of monitors. A doctor approached holding a clipboard, his face lined with fatigue. "You donated blood here about 3 weeks ago, correct?" the doctor asked. "Yes," he replied. "We ran a rapid test. You're the closest match. He won't make it without a transfusion." The worker let the weight of that sentence settle. He stared at the doctor, then at his hands. The same hands that had lifted concrete blocks, patched walls, carried lumber until his back ached. Hands that had wiped sweat from his brow after long days, hands that had opened the door quietly at night so he wouldn't wake his sleeping son, hands that had been insulted, ordered, dismissed. Now those same hands were needed to save the very man who had belittled them. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the conflict rise. A thick silence stretched between him and the corridor outside. He heard the faint echo of a mop swishing across the tiles as a custodian cleaned near the entrance. The rhythm reminded him of evenings sweeping the small kitchen floor at home while his wife stirred a pot on the stove. The smell of garlic and onions would float in the air, warm and comforting, grounding him after a long day. He opened his eyes. The image of the little girl in the pink jacket returned, her trembling shoulders, her fingers gripping the stuffed bear. His chest tightened. Whatever resentment he carried, it dissolved beneath that single memory. A custodian sweeping nearby paused, watching him with kind eyes. She didn't speak. She simply nodded once, as if she understood something he hadn't voiced. Then she continued her work, the soft swish of the mop filling the empty space. A nurse reappeared. "Are you willing?" she asked gently. He didn't hesitate. "Yes." They led him to a narrow room with a window fogged by the humidity of the storm outside. He sat in a reclining chair, the vinyl cold against his back. As the nurse prepared the equipment, he looked at the window. Raindrops raced each other down the glass, merging, separating, falling again. His reflection appeared in the blurred pane, tired eyes, unshaven jaw, a man worn by years of labor and silence. He hardly recognized himself. The nurse wrapped a band around his arm, tapping lightly to find the vein. "You're doing something good," she murmured. "Something not everyone could do." He didn't answer. He just stared at the rain. A memory surfaced. His son beside him one afternoon, holding a small wooden car they had built together. The boy had looked up and said, "Dad, you're the strongest man I know." He hadn't felt strong then, but he felt something now. A steadiness, maybe, or a purpose that overshadowed the humiliation of the past. The needle slid into his skin. Blood flowed through the tube, warm and dark. His vision blurred slightly at the edges, but he kept his gaze fixed on the window. Outside, the storm continued, but a faint glow of morning began to rise through the clouds. In the hallway beyond the doorway, the little girl's quiet crying softened, replaced by the murmured comfort of her mother. The worker let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He didn't know if the boss would survive. He didn't know if there would be thanks or apologies or even acknowledgement, but he knew he had done what he believed was right. A small paper cup of water sat on the side table. He picked it up with his free hand, noticing how steady it remained despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He took a slow sip. The coolness soothed his throat. Somewhere down the corridor, a machine beeped again, steady this time. A sound like a heartbeat finding its rhythm. The nurse checked the bag filling beside him. "Almost there," she said softly. He nodded. He didn't need to say anything. His arm was extended, his blood flowing, his choice made. And yet, even in this quiet sacrifice, something tugged at him. A memory he hadn't touched in years. The last time someone had thanked him. The last time he had felt seen. He pushed the thought aside. This wasn't about him. It was about a child waiting with fear in her eyes. The rain slowed outside. The window softened its trembling. The nurse placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You can rest a moment." He leaned back, the vinyl chair creaking softly beneath him, and let his eyes linger on the door through which the staff had rushed minutes earlier. Everything felt suspended. The storm, the hallway, his breath. And somewhere in that fragile pause, he realized the world had shifted just a little, even if no one else had noticed. He sat in the small recovery bay long after the nurse removed the needle, his arm wrapped in cotton and tape, the faint pressure still marking the place where his blood had left him to find its way into another man's body. The storm had quieted into a soft drizzle outside the window, the kind that painted thin silver lines down the glass and made the world look as though it were exhaling. For a moment he simply watched the raindrops gather and fall, one after another, as though the sky itself remembered what it felt like to be tired. He rubbed his thumb over the edge of the tape on his arm, feeling the slight sting beneath it. He wasn't supposed to think too deeply about what he had just done. Not yet, anyway. But memories have a way of rising when the mind is quiet, and his mind was very quiet now. He closed his eyes, letting the muted hum of hospital machines fade into something older, something softer. He remembered mornings in the small kitchen at home, long before the sun came up. His wife standing barefoot by the stove, her hair tied back loosely, humming a tune she never finished. The smell of coffee drifting through the apartment, the floorboards creaking beneath her as she moved. He remembered the way she would look over her shoulder at him and smile, tired but proud. Those were the mornings he lived for, the moments that reminded him why he kept going when the days felt too heavy. He remembered the day his son was born. A winter morning when the wind howled against the hospital windows, rattling them so hard he thought they might break. He had held the newborn against his chest, tiny and warm, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of detergent. He had whispered a promise, one he carried in his bones even now, to protect him, to work hard, to come home safe, no matter what it took. He opened his eyes slowly, feeling the weight of that promise settle in his chest. He thought about how many times he had come home with bruises hidden beneath his clothes, how many nights he stood in the shower letting the water run over his skin until the sting faded enough to sleep. His wife never asked too many questions. She simply rested her hand on the small of his back and told him dinner was ready. She knew the world wasn't gentle with men like him. A doctor passed by the doorway, glancing in briefly before continuing down the hall. The worker breathed out, steady and slow, and leaned back against the thin cushion of the chair. He felt the fatigue begin to seep into his muscles, not from the donation itself, but from years of carrying burdens no one saw. He rubbed his palms together, the calluses scraping softly. Reminders of the beams he lifted, the bricks he placed, the scaffolding he climbed, the insults he swallowed. A soft shuffle of footsteps broke through the memories. An elderly man wearing thick glasses and holding a paper bag walked by the entrance to the room. The man paused, then turned back. "You look pale," he said gently. "You need something? Water? A snack?" His voice was frail, kind in a way that felt like it had been earned through decades of giving more than he received. "I'm fine," the worker said softly. The old man nodded and smiled. "Still," he whispered, placing the bag on the nearby chair, "take it. My wife always packs too much." Then he walked away, disappearing behind a set of double doors. Inside the bag was a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, an apple, and a folded napkin with flowers printed around the edges. The worker stared at it for a moment, moved by the simplicity of the gesture. He took the napkin between his fingers, feeling its slight texture. It reminded him of something from long ago, a memory he rarely touched. When he was a boy, his mother would tuck small notes into his lunchbox, simple notes, drawn on torn pieces of paper or napkins from the diner where she worked. Sometimes she wrote, "Be kind today." Other times, she just drew a little sun. He used to hide them in his pockets and touch them when school felt too loud or too cruel. He still had one somewhere in a box at home, faded and worn. He folded the napkin slowly, placing it into his jacket pocket as if storing away a piece of warmth. The sound of the rain shifted again. He looked out at the dripping window and saw the reflection of the hallway behind him, nurses rushing. A gurney being pushed, someone sobbing softly into a sleeve. Life and fear intertwined in these corridors. No one was immune. He supposed that included his boss. He remembered the first day the boss had walked across the site. The man's boots were spotless, his shirt pressed, his voice sharp. He barked orders as if he were giving commands in a storm, confident that no one would dare question him. That day, the worker had arrived late because his son had a fever and his wife was exhausted. The boss didn't care. He pointed at the worker in front of the entire crew and said, "If you can't show up on time, don't bother showing up at all." It wasn't just the words that stung. It was the laughter from a few men nearby. The kind of laughter that sticks to the skin. For years, it continued. Small humiliations delivered in public, quiet resentment swallowed in private. The boss had a way of turning every mistake into a spectacle, never missing a chance to belittle someone. He would shout instructions from across the yard as though the worker were a nuisance he couldn't quite shake. He remembered the way the man's face tightened whenever he made eye contact with him, as though the worker represented everything he despised. But he also remembered something else, a moment he hadn't thought about in years. It was late one evening. The sun had already set and most of the crew had gone home. The worker stayed behind to finish a task that needed to be completed before morning. His boss stood by the gate, leaning against the fence, looking at something in his hand. A photo. The boss didn't see the worker watching. In the dim light, he caught a glimpse of the image, the boss holding a small girl, maybe 3 years old, her arms around his neck. He remembered thinking that the expression on the boss's face looked different then, softer, as though he wasn't the same man who spent the day shouting. The memory drifted away like smoke, replaced by newer ones. The arguments, the jabs, the long hours spent in silence. But now, sitting in this white-walled room, he couldn't help but wonder what kind of fear the boss's daughter must be feeling right now. What kind of memories she held close. What kind of promises her father had made to her. The door opened gently. The mother of the little girl entered, her face weary but composed. She held a paper cup of tea in both hands, the steam rising in a thin curl. When she noticed him, she paused, unsure if she should speak. Then she stepped closer. "Thank you," she murmured. Her voice trembled. "They told me someone came forward to donate. They didn't say who." She looked at the bandage on his arm, her eyes filling with quiet understanding. "I don't know how to—" "You don't need to," he said, shaking his head. "I just hope he pulls through." She covered her mouth briefly, nodding as tears escaped down her cheeks. "Our daughter. She's so scared. She hasn't let go of her bear all morning." She wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. "You didn't have to do this." He didn't respond. He simply looked down at his hands resting on his knees, palms open as though accepting the weight of the moment. She stood there for a long breath, then whispered, "Bless you," before leaving the room again. He leaned back, staring up at the ceiling tiles. A faint hum of machinery echoed overhead. He thought about his own son, remembering how the boy had once drawn a picture of their family, him, his wife, and himself, standing beneath a bright yellow sun. The drawing had been taped to the refrigerator for months. Even now, he could still picture the crooked lines, the big circle of the sun, the stick figure arms reaching toward one another. He wondered if the boss's daughter drew pictures too. Another memory rose, one he rarely revisited. His own father lying in a hospital bed years ago. A man hardened by years of labor, by disappointments, by a world that never made room for softness. The worker had stood by the bedside, unsure how to speak to him. His father had looked at him with eyes that apologized for more than they could say. He remembered holding his father's hand, rough, scarred hands, and feeling the faint pulse beneath the skin. He remembered thinking that no matter what had passed between them, no matter the anger or the silence, he didn't want him to die alone. He closed his eyes. That memory settled like dust on old floorboards. Familiar, painful, unavoidable. A soft knock came at the edge of the doorway. A young nurse leaned in, her expression gentle. "We're monitoring his vitals," she said quietly. "The transfusion is helping." She hesitated, then added, "He's lucky someone like you was here today." He shook his head. "It's not about luck." She smiled, understanding more than he said. "You can rest here as long as you need." He nodded and she left. He sat for a long while, listening to the slow drip of rain outside, the distant roll of a gurney passing through the hall, the rustle of papers as a doctor scribbled notes somewhere nearby. Each sound seemed to pull something from his memory, a promise, a regret, a dream tucked away for later. He reached into his jacket pocket, feeling the folded napkin the old man had given him. He unfolded it and placed it gently on his lap. The printed flowers along the edge reminded him of a field near the house where he grew up. A field he used to run through barefoot, the wild grass brushing against his ankles. He rubbed the fabric between his fingers, letting the soft texture draw him back to his present breath. He didn't know how long he sat like that, suspended between past and present, sorrow and purpose. But he knew this. Something inside him had shifted the moment he heard the little girl cry. He stood slowly, walking toward the doorway. His legs felt heavy but steady. Outside, the clouds were beginning to lift, the faintest hint of sunlight pressing against the edges of gray. He didn't know what the next hours would bring. He didn't know if his boss would survive or if anything would change because of what he had done. But he stepped into the hallway anyway, guided not by the past he carried, but by the memory of a trembling child holding onto a stuffed bear, and by the quiet belief that doing what is right matters, even when no one is watching. He walked down the hallway with slow, measured steps, the soles of his boots sticking slightly to the polished floor as if the building itself wanted him to pause before taking another breath. The hospital had settled into that strange midday quiet, the kind where everything feels suspended, where even time seems to wait for someone to make the next move. The storm outside had thinned into a mist, soft enough that light finally seeped through the windows, casting pale reflections across the tiles. He passed the waiting room, where the little girl in the pink jacket now sat on her mother's lap. Her head rested against her mother's chest, her fingers still curled around the earless bear. The worker hesitated at the threshold, torn between wanting to comfort her and fearing he might intrude on a moment not meant for him. He took one step closer, then stopped. The mother lifted her eyes, meeting his with a look that held gratitude, exhaustion, and a quiet hope she could barely voice. "Is he?" the little girl whispered, barely audible. Her mother kissed her forehead. "The doctors are doing everything they can, sweetheart." The worker shifted his weight, unsure whether to offer reassurance he wasn't certain he had the right to give. The girl's gaze drifted toward him again, curious, searching, as if she sensed something gentle in the man she had never seen before today. He gave a small nod, not speaking, but somehow promising her that she wasn't alone. A doctor stepped into the room then, clipboard pressed to his chest. His eyes scanned the occupants before landing on the worker. "Can I speak with you?" he asked quietly. The worker followed him into a narrow alcove near a row of closed blinds. The doctor's voice was calm, but threaded with urgency. "The transfusion helped stabilize him," he said, "but he's not out of danger. We managed to get his heart rhythm under control, but there was more internal damage than we expected." The worker's stomach tightened. He's being prepped for surgery now, the doctor continued. It's going to be a long one. The worker nodded. Will he make it? The doctor exhaled. We hope so. What you did gave him a fighting chance. The worker bowed his head slightly, absorbing the words, a fighting chance. That was more than most people were ever given. He thanked the doctor quietly and stepped back into the corridor. He wandered toward the vending machine, not because he wanted anything, but because it was the only place in the hallway where he could stand without feeling like someone depended on him. He pressed his palm against the cold metal, grounding himself. His reflection in the glass looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, as if this morning had carved its way into him. He thought about his wife again, how she'd react if she knew he'd donated blood to a man who'd spent years making him feel small. She would understand. She always did. She had a way of seeing the world not as a place of debts and scores, but as a place where kindness was never wasted, even when it fell on hard ground. A nurse approached him, holding a clipboard. You're cleared to leave whenever you're ready, she said gently. But if you want to stay in the waiting area, that's fine too. He nodded. I'll stay. She offered a warm smile, then walked away. He returned to the chairs outside the waiting room, settling into one near the corner. A television mounted on the wall played the news on mute, the images moving without sound. Traffic, a smiling weather reporter, a grocery store promotion, ordinary things, strangely distant from the life or death weight pressing on this room. A man in a gray suit sat across from him, speaking anxiously into a phone about a meeting he might miss. A teenage boy tapped his foot nervously while scrolling through his messages. An elderly woman sat with her hands clasped, eyes closed, mouthing a silent prayer. The worker watched them all, absorbed in their separate worlds of fear and hope, realizing how fragile every person felt when life cracked open beneath them. He looked down at his hands again, tracing the veins beneath his skin. These hands. They had built homes for strangers, repaired things others had broken, held his son during fevers, held his wife through storms neither of them spoke about. And today, they had held on to courage long enough to give someone else the chance to live. He leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes just for a moment. He drifted into a memory, one he hadn't touched in years. He was 19, working his first job on a construction crew. His father had come to watch him one afternoon, leaning against the fence with pride glowing from his face. The boss on that site had been a kind man, a rarity. When the young worker dropped a beam and nearly injured himself, the boss didn't shout. He walked over, knelt beside him, and said, "Everyone needs someone who believes they can grow. You'll get there, one step at a time." His father had placed a hand on his shoulder afterward and said, "Listen to men like that. They build more than buildings." The worker inhaled deeply now, eyes still closed, remembering the warmth in those words. When he opened his eyes, the hallway was brighter. The rain had fully stopped, and sunlight now pressed against the windows, casting long, slanted beams across the floor. The mother of the little girl approached him again, her steps quiet. She sat in the chair beside him, hands folded tightly in her lap. "They're starting the surgery," she whispered. He nodded. "How's she doing?" The mother glanced toward her daughter, who was now coloring in a small notebook, pressing the crayons too hard, each stroke filled with fear she couldn't voice. "She's trying to be brave," the mother said. Then her voice softened. "You remind her of someone kind. I don't know why, but she keeps looking at you like she trusts you." He swallowed. "Kids know who's safe," he murmured. She smiled faintly, wiping a tear from her cheek. "You saved her father." He looked away. I just did what I would want someone to do if it were my family." Her breath caught, and for a moment she didn't speak. "If he survives this," she said finally, "I hope he understands what that means." He didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward the doors leading to the operating room, the red light glowing above them like a warning and a prayer all at once. The hours stretched slowly, marked only by the change in shadows and the quiet footsteps of nurses passing by. Every so often, the little girl would turn, glancing at him as if making sure he was still there, and he stayed. Not because he owed anything, not because he expected anything, but because something inside him couldn't leave. Because compassion had opened a door in him he couldn't close again. Near dusk, a doctor finally emerged through the double doors, pulling off his cap. All heads turned. The worker sat forward, hands clasped, heart beating harder than he expected. The doctor stepped toward the mother and knelt slightly so he was eye level with the little girl. And in that fragile pause, just before he spoke, the worker realized he was holding his breath, as though the answer about to be given was not just for them, but for the part of himself he had carried quietly for years. The doctor's voice seemed to stretch the silence before it finally settled into words. "He made it through the surgery," he said softly. The mother's knees buckled, her hand flying to her mouth as she let out a trembling breath that sounded like a prayer breaking open. The little girl clutched her bear and leaned into her mother's side, her eyes wide as though she wasn't sure whether she was allowed to hope yet. "But," the doctor continued, "the next 24 hours are critical. He's stable for now, but his body has a long battle ahead." The mother nodded quickly, tears streaming. "Can we see him?" "In a little while," the doctor replied. "He's still coming out of sedation." The girl whispered, "Is Daddy awake?" "Not yet, sweetheart," the doctor said gently. "But he will know you're close." The worker sat back, the breath he'd been holding escaping in a long, quiet exhale. Relief mixed strangely with something heavier. Not regret, but a kind of ache, as though a hidden muscle inside him had been pulled. The room filled with the sound of soft cries and whispered gratitude, and he felt himself disappearing into the backdrop exactly where he was used to standing. He rose from the chair slowly, his joints stiff from hours of stillness. He didn't want to intrude on the family's moment, so he stepped toward the vending machine again, as though drawn to the quiet corner where no one demanded anything from him. Outside, the sky had shifted into a pale wash of evening light. Headlights from cars in the parking lot cast thin yellow streaks across the wet pavement, making the world look tired, but alive. He ran a hand through his hair and let out a long breath. He should go home. His wife would worry. His son would ask where he was. And yet, his feet stayed rooted to the floor. Something kept him here, something he couldn't fully name. Footsteps approached from behind. He turned to see the mother standing there, her eyes swollen but steady. "Would you come with us when they let us in?" she asked quietly. He blinked, startled. I'm not sure I belong there." "You do," she said simply. "Whether he understands it yet or not, you do." He hesitated. He didn't want this to be about recognition, but he could see the truth in her eyes. She wanted him close because his presence made her daughter feel safe, and because she knew what her husband's life now owed to him, not in a debt sense, but in a way deeper than words could capture. Before he could answer, the little girl stepped from behind her mother, her bear tucked tightly under her arm. She walked up to him, small, messy steps on the linoleum floor. She stopped in front of him and looked up, her eyes an ocean of worry and innocence. "Are you the man who helped my daddy?" she whispered. He knelt to her level. "I just gave a little bit of my blood," he said. "That's all." She shook her head, as children do when the truth they feel is bigger than the words they hear. Then she held out her bear. It took him a moment to understand what she was offering. The bear was worn, missing an ear, the fur matted from tears and years of holding. It was not a toy easily handed over. It was something she clung to when the world frightened her. "You can borrow him," she said, "until Daddy gets better." His throat tightened. His fingers hovered, unsure whether he had the right to accept such a fragile gesture. But she nudged the bear closer, waiting. He finally took it gently, as though it were made of something breakable. "Thank you," he murmured. She nodded, satisfied, then whispered, "You helped him. I want him to help you." Her mother's face crumpled into tears again, this time softer, like something inside her had unclenched at last. A nurse appeared in the doorway. "He's still asleep," she said. "But you can come in now, just for a few minutes." The mother took her daughter's hand. Then she turned back toward the worker. "Will you come?" she asked again, almost pleading this time. He glanced down at the little bear in his hand. He thought of his own son holding out a toy when he scraped his knee years ago. He thought of all the moments when love showed itself not in grand gestures, but in small, trembling offerings. He rose to his feet. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll come." The three of them walked together toward the recovery room. The lights dimmer here, the hallway quieter, as if the entire hospital understood the gravity of what waited behind the curtain. When they stepped inside, the room was filled with a soft, rhythmic beeping. The boss lay unconscious, pale beneath the blankets, an oxygen mask covering his mouth. Tubes and wires connected him to machines that hummed with relentless purpose. He looked smaller somehow, stripped of the authority he'd carried like armor. The mother approached the bed first, brushing her fingers gently across her husband's forehead. The little girl stood on tiptoes, pressing her hand against his arm. The worker stayed near the doorway at first, unsure how close he was allowed to stand to a man who had spent years pushing him away. Then the mother turned to him and whispered, "Come closer." He stepped forward. Each footfall felt like crossing a line he had never imagined crossing. He stood beside the bed now, looking down at the man who had treated him like the lowest rung on a ladder only one of them was allowed to climb. For a long moment, he simply watched the slow rise and fall of the boss's chest. Then something unexpected happened. The boss's eyelids fluttered, not fully, not enough to wake, but enough to stir the room. The mother gasped softly. The girl held her breath. The worker stood still as stone, unsure whether he had imagined it. Then the boss's lips moved faintly beneath the mask, as though forming a word that couldn't break through. And in that fragile, half-awake motion, barely a twitch, something inside the worker shifted again. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something that felt like the beginning of a path he had never expected to walk. The boss's eyelids fluttered again, a slow, uncertain tremor that rippled through the room like a breeze disturbing still water. The mother leaned closer, her hand trembling as she brushed her fingers along his cheek. The little girl pressed her small palm harder against her father's arm, whispering, "Daddy, it's me. I'm here." The worker stood at the foot of the bed, the little bear still in his hand. For a moment, he wasn't sure what to do with it. Hold it, hide it, return it. He simply let it rest against his palm, its worn fur warming slightly beneath his touch. He focused on the boss's face, watching as the man's breathing shifted, becoming heavier, then lighter again, as if his body were relearning a rhythm it had forgotten. A soft beep echoed from one of the monitors. A nurse entered the room, checking the vitals with quick practice movements. "He's coming in and out," she murmured. "His body's trying to wake, but we don't want him to strain." The mother nodded, but her eyes stayed locked on her husband's face. The worker could tell she was memorizing every small movement, the twitch of an eyelid, the faint lift of his brow, as though afraid each moment might slip away before she could catch it. The little girl clutched the side of the bed, her voice barely more than air. "Daddy, come back." Her words dug into him, not because they were loud, but because they were fragile, the kind of fragile that breaks things open inside a grown man. He remembered his own son, younger then, whispering something similar when he was sick in bed years ago. He remembered promising he wasn't going anywhere. He remembered keeping that promise. He stepped a little closer, drawn again by something he couldn't fully name. The boss stirred. His fingers twitched beneath the blanket, curling slightly as though grasping for something unseen. His breath hitched. The nurse watched closely, ready to intervene. But the worker noticed something before she did. A flicker of awareness returning, the faintest shift beneath the mask. The man was fighting his way back. For a moment, the worker found himself silently urging him on, not out of obligation, not out of expectation, but because somewhere deep down he understood what it meant to come back from the edge, to claw his way back to the people waiting on the other side. Minutes passed. The boss's breathing steadied. His eyelids settled again, not fully awake but no longer drifting. The nurse adjusted the blankets, checked the machines one final time, then quietly stepped out. The mother rested her forehead against the side of the bed, shoulders shaking in silent relief. The worker moved toward the doorway, thinking it might be time to leave. He didn't want to overstep. He had already crossed deeper into this family's crisis than he could have ever imagined that morning. But before he could take another step, he heard the mother's voice behind him. "Please, stay." He turned. Her face was still streaked with tears, but her expression held something steady, something that didn't feel like desperation, but sincerity. He hesitated, torn between the instinct to disappear and the quiet truth that something inside him had tethered him here. "Just until he wakes," she added softly. "You should hear it from him." Those words sank deeper than she likely realized. He returned to the chair in the corner of the room, placing the bear gently on his lap. The little girl glanced back at him, watching the way he held her stuffed friend, and seemed comforted by it. She crawled onto the edge of the bed beside her father, hugging his arm as though afraid he might slip away again. The room settled into a warm silence, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. Hours stretched. The mother dozed against the side of the bed. The girl fell asleep curled beside her father, the bear's absence unnoticed only because she knew exactly where it was, and the worker stayed. He didn't speak. He didn't move much. He simply sat with his hands folded, the bear resting quietly between his fingers, watching over a man who had never once watched over him. Somewhere around midnight, a soft groan drifted through the room. The worker sat up straighter. The boss's hand twitched again, this time with more intention. His eyelids pulled apart, not fully, but enough to reveal a sliver of consciousness. His gaze floated unfocused across the dim room, struggling to make sense of the shadows and shapes. The mother stirred awake. "Honey," she whispered, brushing his hair gently. "You're safe. You're here." The girl blinked awake too, instantly alert. "Daddy!" His eyes moved toward her voice, settling on her small face. Something inside him softened, even through the haze of medication. The boss tried to lift his hand but winced from the tubes and wires. His gaze traveled slowly, from his daughter to his wife, to the shadowed corner where the worker sat almost hidden, And for a heartbeat, his eyes locked onto the workers. Confusion flickered first, then disbelief, then something else, something raw and unguarded. Recognition. The worker watched the man's brow tighten in a way he had never seen on the construction site. Not anger, not authority, but realization. The boss's lips parted beneath the oxygen mask as though he wanted to speak, but no words came. His eyes glazed with emotion he wasn't ready to face. The worker lowered his gaze, not wanting to invade the man's vulnerability. But he felt the weight of that moment settle in his chest, the weight of being seen for the first time by someone who had spent years refusing to look. The boss blinked slowly, then shakily raised one hand, not toward his wife, not toward his daughter, but toward the worker. Barely a few inches, barely a gesture, but enough. It was the first time in years the man had ever reached for him. For a long moment, that small, trembling gesture hung in the air. The boss's hand raised only an inch or two, suspended between weakness and intention. The worker stared at it, unsure whether he should move closer or let the moment pass quietly. But something in the man's eyes, something cracked open by fear, pain, and awakening, asked for honesty rather than distance. The worker stood slowly, the little bear still held against his palm. He stepped toward the bedside, each footfall soft on the linoleum floor. The room seemed to dim around them, as if giving space for a truth years overdue. The boss's hand faltered in the air, wavering. The worker reached forward just enough to steady it, his fingers brushing the cold skin of the man who had once barked orders at him from a distance. The boss's eyes filled with something the worker had never seen in them before. Not pride, not frustration, not superiority, but a kind of stunned humility, as if the world he thought he understood had tilted beneath him. His lips moved beneath the oxygen mask. No sound came out, just the faint ghost of a word trying to reach the air. The worker leaned closer, unsure whether he should listen or step back. The mother watched silently, hand pressed to her chest. The daughter clutched her father's arm, her small fingers gripping tightly as if afraid he might disappear again. The boss tried once more. This time, a dry whisper escaped, cracked, and barely there. "Why?" The worker swallowed. He wasn't sure how to answer a question that held years of cruelty behind it. He wasn't sure the man was ready for the truth, or if the truth even needed to be spoken aloud, so he kept it simple, because in moments like this, simple was enough. "You're her father," he murmured, glancing at the girl. "She needed you, that's all." The boss's eyes closed, not from sleep, but from the force of those words. A tear gathered in the corner of his eye, slipping down the side of his weathered face, years of hardness dissolving into something he could no longer hide behind. His hand tightened weakly around the worker's fingers, not to pull him closer, not to claim anything, but in gratitude, in disbelief, in fragile acknowledgement. He held the worker's hand for a long moment before his strength gave out and his arm fell gently back onto the bed. His breathing steadied, exhaustion pulling him down toward sleep again. The mother leaned over, brushing her husband's cheek. The girl whispered, "Daddy's here," her voice shaking with relief. The worker stepped back, his heart pounding in a way he hadn't expected. He returned to the corner of the room, sitting slowly as if the weight of the moment needed space to settle inside him. He stared at his hands, at the little bear resting between them, and felt something shifting in a place he had locked away long ago. Time passed quietly. A nurse came in to adjust the monitors. The lights were dimmed. The mother wrapped her daughter in a blanket and let her curl up at the foot of the bed. The worker remained in the corner, aware that he could leave now, that the hardest part was behind him, but unable to move. It wasn't obligation that held him there, it was something deeper, understanding. In the dim glow of the room, the worker traced the worn fabric of the bear's missing ear with his thumb. His thoughts drifted to his son, imagining the boy asleep now, unaware of the small miracle unfolding hours away. He imagined his wife washing dishes by the dim kitchen light, wondering when he would step through the door. He would tell her tomorrow. Not everything. He didn't have the kind of voice for grand stories, but enough for her to understand why his eyes looked older, softer. The door creaked gently, and a night nurse entered. She glanced at the worker in the corner, and instead of asking him to leave, she gave him a small nod, the kind reserved for people who had earned their place in a room not meant for them. The mother stirred from her half-sleep, whispering, "He's resting. You should go home. You've done so much already." The worker shook his head. "I'll leave soon. I just want to sit a little longer." She studied him for a moment, then smiled. Not the smile of politeness, but of recognition. "He saw you," she said quietly. "Really saw you." The worker looked down, maybe for the first time. She reached out and touched his arm gently. "For what it's worth, I think he needed this more than any of us." He nodded, unable to trust his voice. Hours later, sometime between midnight and dawn, the nurse dimmed the lights further. The mother lay with her daughter curled against her. The boss slept, his chest rising and falling in steady waves, and the worker stood up slowly. He walked to the side of the bed one last time and placed the little bear gently near the girl's arm, its missing ear facing upward like a small banner of loyalty. He stood there longer than he planned, watching the family breathe in quiet unison. He whispered something no one heard, a simple wish for healing, for change, for better days. Then he turned and walked toward the door, each step soft, careful, as though not to disturb the fragile beginning of something new. But as he reached for the handle, he heard a faint shift, not from the machines, not from the mother or child, from the bed. The boss's eyes, half awake, watched him leave, not with judgment, not with pride, but with a look that carried a truth the worker wasn't sure he deserved. "You saved me." Dawn crept slowly across the hospital windows, washing the corridors in a pale gold that dissolved the harshness of the night. The world outside was waking, cars starting, nurses changing shifts, a faint hum of morning settling into the walls. But inside the recovery room, time moved differently, tenderly, as though it understood the weight of everything that had happened. The worker returned before most visitors arrived. He hadn't slept much. After leaving the hospital, he'd walked home through streets still slick with rain, his boots echoing softly against the quiet pavement. His wife had opened the door with worry in her eyes, then listened as he told her, in his simple, understated way, the story of the man who almost died, the child who cried, the blood that saved a life. She touched his cheek, whispered that she was proud of him, and held him until the trembling in his shoulders eased. Now he stood hesitating at the doorway of the recovery room, unsure whether to step inside. The mother noticed him first. She rose from the chair beside the bed, her face softening. The little girl looked up from her coloring book and smiled sleepily, lifting her small hand to wave. He stepped in quietly. The boss was awake, pale, weak, still tethered to wires and machines, but undeniably conscious. His eyes followed every movement in the room, lingering on his wife, resting on his daughter, and finally stopping on the worker who had just walked in. The mother whispered something to her husband, squeezed his hand, then guided their daughter into the hallway to give them space. The door clicked softly behind them. For the first time in their lives, the two men were alone. The worker shifted his weight, suddenly aware of the dirt dried on his boots, the cheap jacket on his shoulders, the calluses on his hands. He didn't know whether he should approach or apologize for being there. He settled for standing still, his hands loosely clasped. The boss swallowed with difficulty. His voice came out rough, scraped raw by tubes and trauma. "You stayed." The worker nodded. "I did." A long silence followed. The boss looked down at the blanket, then back at the man he had insulted more times than he could count. Shame flickered across his features, thin, sharp, unmistakable. "I remember," the boss whispered, struggling for breath. "I remember your face when they said a donor was here. I thought I was dreaming." "You weren't." The boss's voice cracked. "Why? After everything I did to you? Why?" The worker took a moment before answering. His gaze didn't waver. "Because your daughter was crying," he said quietly. "Because she needed you to come back. And because sometimes the world gives you a chance to do something right, even when it never gave you much else." The boss blinked slowly, emotion tightening his jaw. His fingers curled around the blanket, trembling. "I treated you terribly," he rasped. "I know that. I knew it even while I was doing it. I never expected to have to face it." "You don't have to explain," the worker murmured. "Just be better after this." The simplicity of the words landed harder than any accusation could have. The boss exhaled shakily, a tear escaping the corner of his eye. He wiped it clumsily, his pride too weak to stop the honesty spilling out of him. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The worker didn't move, but something softened in his expression. Not full forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of a bridge that hadn't existed before. "I don't expect you to forgive me," the boss added. "I don't deserve it." "Maybe not," the worker replied gently. "But you have a daughter who loves you, and that's reason enough to try." The boss swallowed again, pain rippling across his face. "I want to change," he said. "I don't know how, but I want to." "You start the same way everybody does," the worker said. "One honest day at a time." The boss closed his eyes briefly, letting those words settle. When he opened them again, they were clearer, steadier. "Can I ask you something?" he rasped. "Sure." "When I get out of here, would you let me talk to you? Not as your boss, just as a man trying to fix what he broke." The worker hesitated, not because he was unsure of the answer, but because the moment itself was heavy, delicate. Then he nodded once. "Yeah," he said, "I can do that." A small breath of relief left the boss's chest. The door opened slightly. The little girl peeked in, eyes wide and hopeful. "Daddy?" she whispered. The boss motioned weakly for her to come closer. She rushed to the bed, clinging to his arm. The worker stepped back to give them space, watching as father and daughter folded into each other with trembling gratitude. The mother entered behind her, tears streaming, and kissed her husband's forehead. They looked like a family holding the moment as tightly as they could. The worker turned to leave, his hand resting on the door handle. Before he could step out, the boss's voice, faint but firm, stopped him. "You saved my life," he whispered. The worker didn't turn fully, just looked back over his shoulder. "You saved your own," he said softly. "I just helped you get there." He stepped into the hallway, letting the door fall gently closed behind him. The morning light felt different on his skin, warmer, deeper, carrying the quiet truth of a man who had given more than anyone knew. As he walked toward the exit, he passed the vending machine, the chairs, the hallway where he had first stood soaked from the rain. And he realized something that made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't expected. He wasn't leaving as the same man who walked in. Outside, the sun finally broke through the last of the storm clouds. A new day for all of them.